So, the breaking news tonight is that Buckingham Palace has finally confirmed what half of London has been whispering about for weeks. King Charles is stepping back from his public duties, and the balance of power inside the palace is shifting toward Prince William and Catherine. But that's not the part everyone is talking about. The real story is a handwritten sentence buried at the bottom of the succession order. A sentence that effectively removed Camilla from the monarchy's decision-making process completely. And from what we're hearing, she didn't see it coming until the document had already been signed and sealed. If you've been following the royal family, you already know that Charles has spent months trying to project an image of stability. We saw the carefully staged photographs of him working at his desk, the official statements insisting he was still keeping up with his red boxes, and the repeated assurances that his cancer treatment wasn't slowing him down. But behind the scenes, the reality was very different. Meetings were being cancelled, ceremonies were shortened, and Prince William was quietly taking on more and more of the king's public responsibilities. What we're learning now is that the breaking point came during a rehearsal for a state ceremony in London. Charles arrived determined to push through it, but witnesses say he simply couldn't keep up. The color drained from his face, his responses became shorter, and his focus started to drift. Eventually, the room had to be cleared, and his doctors were called in. Their message was direct. If he didn't stop pushing himself, he risked undoing all the progress he had made. He needed to hand over most of his responsibilities immediately and prepare for a much longer absence than anyone had publicly acknowledged. That led to an emergency meeting at Buckingham Palace. William, Catherine, Princess Anne, and a small group of constitutional advisors were summoned without any explanation. Before we get into what happened in that room, I have to ask you a quick question. Are you happy that Charles chose William and Catherine over Camilla? Let me know in the comments below. And if you think Camilla has held on to palace influence for far too long, don't just watch the story in silence. Like this video and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what happens next, because this story is far from over. So, everyone was gathered around the table, and a sealed folder sat in the center. The title was simple: The Royal Continuity and Succession Order. At first, William assumed it was simply about a few cancelled engagements. Catherine believed it was only a temporary adjustment. But then Charles opened the document and explained what it actually meant. It transferred state audiences, senior palace appointments, ceremonial planning, and the long-term direction of the monarchy directly to William. Then he turned to Catherine. Under this order, she would take on responsibilities normally expected of the reigning queen: state banquets, diplomatic receptions, and the royal household's public program. In other words, the highly visible duties that signal to Britain and the Commonwealth, who now stands at the center of royal life. Catherine didn't answer immediately, and honestly, that's understandable. Accepting a role like that changes the way every future appearance is interpreted. It's one thing to support your husband. It's something entirely different to step into a position that makes it seem as though you're already the queen in waiting. William pushed back as well. He told Charles that people might believe he had forced this transition, that it could appear to be ambition rather than necessity. But Charles was firm. He said the decision was his alone, and that protecting the monarchy couldn't mean pretending his strength hadn't changed. He was trying to protect them from the criticism. But this is where things become strange. Before the meeting continued, Princess and placed a second folder on the table. Inside were confidential notes from members of Camilla's household. These weren't casual emails. They were plans. Plans outlining how Camilla could maintain her authority if Charles stepped back. Plans explaining how her office could continue influencing ceremonies, appointments, and the palace's public program. There were even discussions about treating William's authority as temporary, even if Charles remained absent for months. William read the first page twice. Catherine remained completely still. The implications were impossible to ignore. While Charles was struggling to fulfill his duties, Camilla's household was already discussing ways to keep power in her hands. And neither William nor Catherine had been included in those conversations. Charles hadn't approved any of it. He had discovered the documents before the proposal could move any further. The wording in those notes was extremely careful. Nothing sounded openly rebellious. No one used the word power, but every line pointed in the same direction. Camilla's office had been preparing for Charles's absence before William had even been informed about how serious that absence might become. The proposal outlined an advisory arrangement based at Clarence House. It would allow Camilla's office to review ceremonial plans, recommend changes to the royal diary, and remain involved in state banquets and public appearances. One paragraph even suggested that William's expanded authority should be described as temporary, even if Charles stayed away for months. That single sentence changed the atmosphere in the room. William immediately asked who had written it. Charles turned to another page and pointed to a list of names. Senior members of Camilla's office, private secretaries, household advisors. Charles read the names in complete silence. He hadn't approved the meeting. He hadn't requested the proposal. And he certainly hadn't been told that his wife's household was already discussing ways to preserve its influence after he stepped away. Catherine's attention shifted to the margins of the document. There were handwritten notes beside the proposals. One recommendation suggested that major ceremonial decisions should require consultation with the Queen's office. Another warned against allowing Kensington Palace to become the monarchy's only center of authority during the King's recovery. The message hidden beneath all that polite language was impossible to miss. William could carry the responsibility, but Camilla intended to keep her hand on the controls and explained that the documents had reached her after a senior aide became uncomfortable with the discussions. The concerns had been presented as continuity, stability, and experience. Palace language has a way of making almost anything sound harmless. But Charles closed the folder and asked the question everyone in the room was already thinking. Did Camilla know about this? And explained that the conversations had taken place within Camilla's household, but the documents didn't clearly indicate how much she had personally approved. William immediately looked toward the door, ready to confront her on the spot. Charles stopped him. He said this couldn't become a confrontation in the palace corridors, not with staff moving throughout the building and reporters closely watching every adjustment to the royal schedule. Camilla would be summoned privately and given an opportunity to explain. The meeting paused for 20 minutes. William walked into an adjoining room that overlooked the gardens. His anger hadn't disappeared. It had settled into something much colder. Catherine followed him and reminded him that the documents were dangerous precisely because they sounded reasonable. A public accusation would only give Camilla's office an opportunity to deny everything and portray William as someone impatient to claim the crown. He understood, and that only made the situation worse. When Camilla finally entered the room, Charles was sitting at the head of the table with the folder still closed. William stood near the fireplace. Catherine sat directly across from the chair prepared for Camilla. No one raised their voice. The silence was powerful enough. Charles asked her directly whether her household had discussed creating an advisory council based at Clarence House after his withdrawal. Camilla paused before answering. She said that responsible staff members had simply considered several possible scenarios. She described it as preparation, not ambition. She argued that a monarchy facing uncertainty couldn't afford to ignore experience. She had stood beside Charles through years of public pressure. She understood the diplomatic calendar, the machinery behind royal ceremonies, and the personalities within the royal household. Removing her office from every major decision, she argued, wouldn't create stability. It would create disruption. Then she made her proposal. The order, she said, should be amended. She suggested establishing a formal position that would allow her to maintain influence over state banquets, ceremonial appointments, charitable patronages, and the monarchy's public program. William would oversee constitutional matters. Catherine could represent the crown alongside him. But Camilla's household would remain involved whenever tradition, protocol, or the king's interests were at stake. It sounded like a compromise. It wasn't. Catherine asked a single question. Who would make the final decision when William and Camilla disagreed? Camilla replied that Charles's wishes should guide them. But that was exactly the problem. Charles's absence was the reason this entire arrangement existed in the first place. Yet Camilla's proposal still depended on him settling disputes from private rooms while trying to recover. The burden would eventually return through phone calls, competing instructions, and constant appeals for intervention. And opened the folder and slid a page toward Charles. It described William's authority as temporary. Charles looked at it carefully. The constitutional advisor then addressed the question everyone had been avoiding. Could Camilla's household challenge the order after it had been signed? The advisor examined the final page and said there was one way to ensure that they never could. He explained that a transfer of duties could always be challenged through interpretation. A household might claim consultation rights. An aide might delay an appointment. A disputed instruction could be returned for clarification. None of those actions would overturn William's authority, but each one could slow it down, weaken it, and eventually force the king back into the struggle he was desperately trying to leave behind. Charles understood that this was no longer about whether William was capable of carrying the workload. It was about whether anyone would be allowed to obstruct him while claiming they were protecting the crown. William stepped away from the fireplace and sat across from his father. He told Charles that he wouldn't accept authority built on public humiliation. He wouldn't stand before the country as though illness had created an opportunity for personal advancement. If the announcement moved forward, it had to protect the king's dignity. Charles nodded. Stepping aside wasn't surrender, he said. It was a decision made before weakness allowed others to make that decision for him. Catherine then asked how the transition would be presented. Her concern was simple: clarity. The country couldn't be shown one arrangement while the palace operated under another. If William was expected to lead, the public program had to reflect that reality. If Catherine was expected to assume the visible responsibilities of a queen, no private office could quietly revise her decisions. Everyone in the room watched Charles closely. He had spent years trying to balance affection, duty, history, and guilt. And now, every possible compromise led back to the same problem. Camilla wanted recognition for standing beside him. William needed unquestioned authority as the heir. Catherine needed protection from accusations that she had claimed something that wasn't hers. The monarchy needed a single voice, and only one of those needs could shape the order. The advisors began revising the document. Clauses granting consultation rights to the Queen's household were removed. State audiences would be transferred directly to William. Senior palace appointments would require his approval. Long-term planning would move under his office. Catherine would oversee state banquets, diplomatic receptions, ceremonial presentation, and the royal household's public program. She would remain the bridge, not the ruler, not the rival, the witness. For nearly an hour, Charles reviewed every line. He asked what would happen if his recovery lasted weeks, then months, then even longer than anyone expected. The answers became more uncomfortable each time. A temporary arrangement couldn't remain temporary forever simply because no one wanted to acknowledge what might come next. The crown couldn't exist inside a pause. Charles reached the final page, the signature line set beneath the royal seal. Beside it rested the fountain pen prepared by his private secretary. William expected him to sign. Catherine expected another delay. Then she noticed his hand move away from the signature line and toward the empty space beneath the final clause. He began writing slowly. No authority, granted through this document, may be challenged by the Queen's household. That single sentence changed everything. William read it once. Then he read it again. The order was no longer just a medical arrangement. It had become a barrier. Charles hadn't simply transferred responsibility to his son. He had blocked the one office most likely to challenge how that responsibility would be exercised. Catherine looked toward Anne and showed no sign of surprise, but her silence revealed that she fully understood the significance of what had just happened. Charles had chosen institutional certainty over private peace, and he had written those words in his own hand. That detail mattered. Typed language could always be blamed on advisors. Legal wording could be described as routine, but a handwritten sentence from the king couldn't be dismissed as an administrative misunderstanding. Charles signed beneath the sentence, and signed as a witness. William placed his hand on the document, but didn't pick it up. For a few moments, father and son remained on opposite sides of the table, fully aware that the paper between them had changed far more than the royal schedule. It had shifted the center of power. A secretary entered, sealed the copies, and asked where the first one should be delivered. Charles answered without hesitation. Clarence House. Camilla received the document before the official announcement had even been drafted. She turned the pages, reached the handwritten sentence, and stopped. Then she called for her staff. The meeting at Buckingham Palace was over. The battle over what Charles had signed was only beginning. At Clarence House, Camilla's staff expected anger. Instead, they saw control. She placed the copy of the order on the table and instructed each advisor to read the handwritten sentence. No one spoke. The words were too direct. They left no room for negotiation. There was no quiet path back into palace decision-making. There was no opportunity to argue that William's authority still depended on her approval. Camilla asked whether the sentence could be softened before the announcement. Her legal advisor responded carefully. The king had written it himself. The royal seal had already been applied and had witnessed the signature. Any attempt to alter the wording would require Charles to reopen the order. Camilla immediately understood the problem. Charles had closed the door before she had the chance to reach it. Her private secretary suggested that she still appear beside him. A public display of unity might preserve some of the influence the document had removed. Camilla rejected the idea. Standing in front of palace cameras, while William and Catherine were presented as the new center of the monarchy, would look like acceptance. Even worse, it would turn her into a witness to her own exclusion. She refused to give them that image. Across London, Buckingham Palace was moving with unusual speed. Communications officers began drafting the statement. Ceremonial staff measured positions inside the throne room. Security teams revised arrival plans. Government representatives in Westminster received restricted notice that the king would address the nation regarding the future management of royal duties. Every word was chosen carefully. Charles was not abdicating. William was not being crowned. Catherine was not being declared queen. And yet, every practical detail pointed toward the same conclusion. Authority was shifting. Public responsibility was shifting. The visible weight of the crown was shifting with it. The official palace statement would call it continuity, but everyone in that room knew exactly what it was. Then Charles added a line that his advisors had never prepared. The future must not wait for pride to acknowledge what duty already understands. No one asked for that line to be removed. At Clarence House, Camilla received the final schedule. Her arrival time had been left blank. A place beside Charles remained available during the opening statement, but no role had been assigned to her afterward. She could attend as his wife. She could not participate as a decision-maker. That distinction cut deeper than any public insult. Camilla sent one final message to Buckingham Palace. She asked whether Charles would reconsider the restrictions placed on her household if she appeared beside him. The reply arrived 20 minutes later. The order would remain exactly as it had been signed. Camilla canceled her car. Outside Buckingham Palace, broadcasters began their live coverage. Crowds gathered beyond the gates. Newsrooms across the United Kingdom cleared their schedules. The first images showed senior officials entering through a side entrance, followed by, and then William and Catherine. Camilla was nowhere to be seen. Rumors spread immediately. Some suggested illness. Others pointed to a private disagreement. Palace officials repeated the same response. A family matter. Inside, Charles waited in a private room with the original order resting beside him. William arrived first. Catherine followed shortly afterward and stood near the window, watching the courtyard below slowly fill with cameras. Charles looked exhausted, but his voice remained steady. He told William that the announcement would permanently change how the public viewed their relationship. From that moment forward, every decision would be analyzed for signs of conflict. Every absence would become a new theory. Every public appearance would be interpreted as a statement. William replied that he would honor the reign that was already underway. Catherine remained silent. Her attention was fixed on the two ceremonial chairs visible through the open doors. One had been prepared for William. The other had been prepared for her. A palace aide entered the room and confirmed that Camilla would not be attending. Charles closed his eyes for a brief moment, then gave the order to begin. The cameras went live. The palace doors opened, and before Charles spoke a single word, Britain had already seen who chose to stand beside the future and who chose to stay away. Charles entered the prepared room alone. For several seconds, he stood behind the lectern without saying anything. The cameras immediately captured the strain around his eyes. No official palace statement could conceal it. He looked determined, but the effort required to remain standing was impossible to ignore. Then he began. He told the country that duty sometimes required a person to recognize the difference between endurance and service. Continuing at any cost, he said, would not protect the monarchy. It would expose it to uncertainty. His recovery required distance from the daily demands of the crown, and the institution required leadership capable of acting without hesitation. Then he named William. His words were carefully chosen, but their meaning echoed through London. Westminster, and every newsroom covering the address. William would assume responsibility for state audiences, senior palace appointments, and the long-term direction of the royal household. The transition would begin immediately. Then Charles named Catherine. She would oversee state banquets, diplomatic receptions, ceremonial presentation, and the public program connected to the crown. Her role would not be symbolic. She would stand beside William whenever the monarchy needed to show the country who now carried its public responsibilities. The room remained completely silent. Charles never mentioned Camilla. That omission landed harder than any criticism ever could. He thanked those who had supported him throughout his treatment. He spoke about continuity. He spoke about family. He spoke about the future. But the woman who had stood beside him throughout his reign was absent from both the room and the transfer of authority. At Clarence House, Camilla watched the address with two members of her staff. She didn't react when William's name was announced. She remained still when Catherine's new responsibilities were outlined. Only after Charles completed his speech without assigning her any continuing role did she reach for the copy of the order once again. The handwritten sentence remained beside the royal seal. Nothing had changed. Back at Buckingham Palace, Charles stepped away from the lectern. William entered through the side doors. He wasn't smiling. He approached his father, lowered his head, and promised to honor the reign Charles had built. The moment had been carefully managed. The emotions behind it had not. Charles placed one hand on William's arm and quickly pulled it away, almost as if holding on any longer might reveal more than he intended. A few steps later, Catherine joined them. She wore no crown, no tiara, no symbol that suggested celebration. Her expression carried the weight of the decision more clearly than any speech could, and watched from the edge of the room. She had witnessed constitutional moments disguised as pageantry before. This was different. There were no cheers inside the palace, no music, no feeling of victory. There was only a family trying to transform a private crisis into a public image of stability. Then Charles left. The cameras remained. William and Catherine turned toward the throne room, where the two ceremonial chairs had been positioned beneath the royal insignia. They began walking together slowly enough for every broadcaster across the United Kingdom to capture the moment. The symbolism was immediate. This wasn't a coronation, but it looked very much like the beginning of something that couldn't easily be reversed. William stopped in front of the first chair. Catherine paused beside the second. Neither of them said immediately. For one suspended moment, they remained standing, fully aware that the country was watching them inherit responsibility long before it inherited a new monarch. Then William took his seat. Catherine followed. Within minutes, those images had spread across television screens and mobile phones throughout the country. Commentators immediately began debating whether the palace had crossed an invisible constitutional line. Supporters described the move as necessary for stability. Critics questioned how temporary the transfer of authority could really be when the entire ceremony had been designed to present William and Catherine as the monarchy's new center. One question dominated every broadcast. Where was Camilla? Palace officials continued repeating the same explanation. Her absence was a private family matter. The answer satisfied no one. Reporters outside Buckingham Palace had already discovered that her car had been cancelled before the address began. Others learned that no future ceremonial role for her had been included in the public briefing. The explanation was beginning to fall apart. Inside Clarence House, Camilla asked for the television to be turned off. She had expected Charles to reduce his schedule. She had not expected him to make William's authority visible to the entire world. And she certainly hadn't expected Catherine to take on responsibilities that Camilla believed should remain connected to her own position. Her title hadn't been taken away. Her influence had. After the cameras were gone, a private secretary handed William the signed order instead of the public copy. He studied the final page and noticed something he had missed during the meeting. Charles had placed the handwritten restriction directly above the royal seal. Anyone attempting to challenge William's authority would have to read that sentence before reaching the king's signature. It wasn't an afterthought. It was the entire point. William carried the original order into a smaller audience room after the broadcast had ended. The noise outside Buckingham Palace continued, but inside, the building felt strangely empty. Charles was standing near the window. Catherine remained beside a table covered with briefing papers. and stood near the door holding the second sealed folder that no one had discussed. William placed the document in front of his father and asked a single question. Was the handwritten restriction really necessary? Charles didn't answer immediately. He looked at the sentence above the seal, the line that had transformed a medical arrangement into a clear boundary. Then he admitted what the public statement had left unsaid. His doctors had forced him to reduce his workload. Camilla's private preparations had forced him to decide where authority would end. Without that sentence, every decision could have turned into a negotiation. An appointment made by William could have been questioned at Clarence House. A state banquet planned by Catherine could have been revised through private messages. A ceremonial invitation could have been delayed until Charles stepped in. The king would have withdrawn in public while continuing to settle disputes behind closed doors. That wasn't recovery. It was another form of captivity. Charles told William that he had spent too many years believing that personal loyalty could be balanced against institutional clarity. This time, there could be no blurred lines, no rival office, no second court operating through friendship, access, or tradition. William listened without interrupting. The anger he had carried earlier began to fade. His father hadn't written the restriction to humiliate Camilla. He had written it because he understood how quickly uncertainty could become control. Catherine understood the cost in a quieter way. Charles had protected their authority, but in doing so, he had exposed a fracture within his own household. The public would remember a carefully managed transition. The family would remember the argument behind it, and finally stepped away from the door. She said that historians would likely study that sentence for years because it marked the exact moment Charles stopped trying to satisfy everyone. As king, he had chosen a single line of command. As a husband, he had accepted the consequences. At Clarence House, Camilla was reaching the same conclusion. Her title remained. Her staff remained. Her residence, engagements, and private charities remained. Yet the machinery that gave those things influence had shifted away from her. Future decisions would come from William's office. Ceremonial instructions would carry Catherine's approval. Appeals to Charles would no longer reopen matters that had already been settled. Camilla hadn't lost everything, but she had lost the one thing that mattered most: the ability to shape what happened next. By evening, images of William and Catherine standing beneath the royal insignia had spread across Britain. Supporters called it stability. Critics described it as a quiet transfer of power. Palace officials refused to accept either description. Charles asked William for one final promise. The transition must never become a campaign against Camilla. There would be no public retaliation, no deliberate humiliation, no attempt to erase her from his reign. William agreed, but his promise came with one condition. Respect would never mean surrendering authority. Catherine agreed. Camilla would be treated with dignity, but she would not be allowed to reopen decisions through private pressure. That was the settlement. Cold, clear, final. Then, and placed the second sealed folder on the table. Charles looked at it and asked whether it could wait, and replied that it couldn't. The cover carried a simple title: Queen's Household Privileges and Residences After the Transition. Inside were instructions concerning staff access, ceremonial invitations, and the royal properties Camilla could continue using while Charles remained away from public duties. One page addressed Clarence House, another focused on Buckingham Palace. But the final page contained a handwritten note beside Camilla's name. It identified the exact date when her unrestricted access to the palace could end. And it had already been approved before the announcement in the throne room had even begun. Camilla hadn't seen it. William hadn't seen it. And when and opened the final page, even Charles appeared surprised by what had already been authorized. The decision carried a deadline measured not in years, but in days. And that document, along with the single royal residence Camilla could be ordered to leave first, is where the next story begins.